All right. Think we're live. Welcome back to another episode of Gerard's Midnight Theater. And before anyone gets here, I'd just like to lay out the topic for tonight. I'm just going to talk a little bit about my city. As many of you know, I'm a New Yorker. I'm a multi-generational New Yorker. My family's been living here. Depending on which branch of the family tree you look at, since before the mid 19th century. No, Christine, I saw a brief clip of President Trump's speech that was posted on another YouTube channel, not a news channel, but only about 20 or 30 seconds. I mostly follow these things through social media. Hi, Inky. But speaking of politics, I guess. Hey, GW. I want to talk about New York. Like I said, my family's been here a long time, and so I have some experience with the city. And I was thinking about an article. I forget if this was posted in the Federalist. I think it was posted in the Federalist by someone who was explaining why he's leaving New York. And you see these articles periodically, but what it reflects now is that there are a lot of not just people getting sick of New York City, because that happens a lot. There's a lot of outward migration from New York State, particularly, but the people that are fleeing now are productive workers and entrepreneurs and businesses. And it's not surprising, since they're the most mobile. Which makes it even more baffling. The response to this has been to threaten to increase taxes on the people that are remaining, the people that, and Governor Cuomo, as hapless and pathetic as he is, he pointed this out. The tax base, particularly in New York City, is so incredibly narrow. Less than 1% of the population uh, basically bankrolls over half of the spending. And this is why whenever you hear one of these idiotic New York politicians celebrating that Rush Limbaugh or Donald Trump, or pick whichever liberal bête noir you you pick whichever one you choose, abandons New York. It's not just that one person abandoning New York, it's millions and sometimes tens of millions of dollars abandoning New York. And uh, I don't know how many of you remember this, but there was a very wealthy businessman that left New Jersey, and he provided so much revenue to the state that they had to readjust their budget. And this is what happens when you live in a state or a city. Hey, Nate. Hi, Scott. When you live in a city and you live in a state where the people who run things are inimical to capital accumulation and production and wealth creation, they they don't understand price calculation, and they don't understand time preference. And the result is you have cities that are imploding economically, and a process of what Hans Hermann Hoppe calls de-civilization. So this is what happens: you have a a regression from civilization to something that antedates civilization, a kind of feudal or even pre-feudal society where there's no guaranteed property rights, where there's no there's no expected you can't anticipate what the state is going to do, or, what the value of your money is going to be. So you increasingly have this high time preference. You make decisions very short term, um, uh, very short term decision making that results in a primitive economy, and eventually it just society collapses. And that's what you have. This is illustrated when you buy Mayor de Blasio's remarks a few days ago, which were widely reported. He and the state as well, I think, are being sued by businesses who want to know when they can reopen. And when New York City is one of the only parts of the state, in fact, it's the only part of the state where there's no indoor dining allowed. So once October hits, so in other words, restaurants have another month where they can actually serve customers at the restaurant, and that's it. There's no plans. There's no plan to actually facilitate business after that. And De Blasio's response was, people are pointing this out and saying, well, if this continues, there are already tens of thousands of people out of work. There are already thousands of businesses that have collapsed, that have filed for bankruptcy, that have left New York. What's going to happen to New York? And his response was essentially to just shrug it off and say, well, New York City's always been around. There'll always be, and this is the response you get when it's pointed out that there are tens of thousands of people leaving. The response is, well, they'll just be replaced. Well, who will they be replaced to? It's not a question of whether or not there'll be people that'll come to New York. It's a question of what type of city New York will be in the future, and what type of state it'll be in the future. And his response is essentially to shrug it off. And this is what happens when you don't have a grounding in economics. You don't understand that the reason New York City is New York City, it's not some sort of magical serum. It's not. I mean, New York City, it's the way it is because of individual decisions made by Dutch and then English merchants, years and years of capital accumulation, and policies that didn't try to disinhibit this behavior, that actually encouraged people to be entrepreneurs, to engage in commerce. That's the reason that New York City is New York City. It's the reason that the Netherlands is the Netherlands. And conversely, the reason that Zimbabwe is Zimbabwe, or that Mexico is Mexico, is because they pursued different policies, and they had different. You know, none of these things are static. It's not as if New York City was created um, from scratch and it was this booming metropolis. People often invoke Detroit, and they'll show pictures of Detroit next to Hiroshima or Nagasaki in order to illustrate the point that Detroit, uh, what Detroit is now, is the result of decades of short-sighted policies, public policies. Detroit at one point was the fourth largest city in the United States, behind New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia. It not only had an urban core that was home to thriving businesses and communities. It also had the suburban communities you see now outside of Detroit are a result of the policies that are gradually eroding um, eroding faith in New York City and leading people to flee the city. You have people that they're not only dealing with these arbitrary regulations and what are essentially takings. That you have the government seizing property via regulation, taxation, all of these arbitrary rules and fines, which have intensified during the past 5 month lockdown. This is a bonanza for politicians who are eager to use the levers of government in order to manipulate and, and social engineer things. And it's just it it illustrates how ignorant the people who are entrusted with power are. And I mentioned Hoppe earlier, and a good book by Hoppe is Democracy: The God That Failed, and it's very good because it analyzes this process where you have democratic government essentially reversing civilization and all of the gains that had been accumulated over the centuries. You have a democratic majority, or sometimes not even a majority. This is another this is another downside of quote unquote democratic government. In many cases, it's not even a majority of the population; it's a plurality of the population, which is motivated enough to go out and vote, which in most cases is simply them voting for to themselves another a portion of someone else's property or wealth. And De Blasio is a great example of this. He was elected by less than a quarter of eligible voters, not even a quarter of the population of New York City, which is around 8 million people, but a quarter of the electorate. So a small minority elected someone who has presided over the ruin of the largest city, one of the most important cities in the United States, and the economic center of New York and the Northeast. He's essentially allowed looters to despoil an entire city. And I, with the approval of a small minority of the electorate. But even if it had been a majority, you have to question whether or not that's uh, it. You have to question whether or not that would have been a just result. I mean, if 51% of the population or 51% of the electorate had and had agreed with what De Blasio was doing, that still wouldn't have made it ethical. It wouldn't have made it just, because there's certain innate rights, natural rights that attend to people that the government can't abridge, even if it does so with the support of a majority of the public. But the fact that the cities and the state's leaders aren't even considering the notion that these policies are irreversible, this idea that New York City has some sort of magical resistance um, to the laws of price calculation and time preference and basic economics, that there's some immunity that New York City has that Detroit didn't, or that pick any of these large cities in the Rust Belt that are now dead, basically, after once being the economic linchpins of their state. I mean, you can choose any of these things. I mean, Pennsylvania is littered with them. But the point is, uh, the idea that New York City is again, this is the type of thinking that arises when you don't understand economics. It's almost like these cargo cults that worship that where a you know a pile of luggage falls down in some Melanesian or Polynesian island, and it's seen as a some sort of deity. That's kind of it's the same type of thinking. They think, oh well, New York City has always been this great thriving metropolis, therefore it'll be that way in perpetuity. And they don't understand the reason why that is, why New York City is New York City. There's nothing there's nothing inherently special about New York City, about the soil, or there's no magic dirt. It's it's just a lot of individuals making choices. Um, a lot of individuals making choices relevant to their survival and the enhancement of their life through mutual contracts, and the idea that you can just keep piling on, just keep crushing people under this burden, and there'll be no negative consequences is ridiculous. I mean, in the same breath, you have De Blasio just describing how he has to cut several $1 billion from the budget. Well, why is that? That's because the economy has collapsed, because people haven't been allowed to work for the past for nearly half a year now. It's just they don't understand basic economics. That doesn't surprise me. There are a lot of third party candidates, particularly this was one of the reasons that you had this this wave of socialists after Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, because the DSA was pouring resources into these assembly districts and state senate districts that were basically monolithic. There were there was no real Republican opposition in these districts in places like the Bronx or Queens or, truthfully, most of New York City outside of Staten Island. And you would have socialists pour resources and send dozens of these volunteers to help their candidates defeat the incumbent Democrat. And yeah, so I mean, I just wanted to talk a little bit about that, because it's sort of infuriating for people that even for people who don't have a sophisticated understanding of economics, they can recognize cause and effect, and they see millions of people who are unemployed. They see businesses. I went by one of the main avenues that would be considered part of a business district recently, and there were real estate signs, and closed. Almost every other business had been closed, had been permanently. They had real estate signs, realtor signs in the window. Almost every other business, the entire boulevard was lined with these signs. And of course, I mean, there are some businesses that are granted exemptions because they're quote unquote essential businesses. But again, this is something the people who are making these decisions don't understand economics. They don't understand that the government is not qualified to allocate resources. They don't have the ability to make the decisions that millions of people make when they make individual choices about what they're going to buy, or who they're going to buy it from, or what the price point at which, like, these are things that are just beyond their understanding. Yeah, that's a great example. A store that had been open nearly a century closed. Using de Blasio's logic, that store should still be in existence, because it was a landmark. But guess what? It's not. It's closed. It's not coming back. So anyway, I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and hopefully I'll see you again soon. Bye.